So this is going to be our last module of the day, and we're going to talk about a few things, and namely those few things are going to be wizards. We can talk about generating dynamic components or dynamically generating components in a page. And then we're going to talk about controllers for custom components, and then we will talk about testing. Okay? So let's jump into this. Multi-step wizards. The idea behind multi-step wizards is that you have multiple pages and a single controller. Okay? So if we think about a situation that would be a multi-step wizard, to me the classic one is buying an airplane ticket. You know, you go through many different pages, you're making different selections, there's a high degree of dependency based on what you did on page 1 that drives page 2. In my case, I'm going to do a highly simplistic 2-page wizard. Okay, so we want to build a 2-page wizard. So first of all, let's start here over on the HTML side. So there's a Visualforce page. So here's my Visualforce page 1. And then over here, I'm going to have my Visualforce controller. The architecture for a multi-step wizard is to have, like I said, multiple pages and a single controller. Okay? So if we were to map out how a user would be working with this, this application, they would probably do something like click on a button which requests a Visualforce page. We would then probably need to populate that page with data by calling some getters. That generates some output HTML which we send down to the requesting web browser. What happens at that point is the user fills out a form and posts it up to the controller. We call the setters within the controller, right? We populate that with data, and then we forward the user over to page 2. It's going to call the getters associated with that, populate it with some data. We probably also executed an action method here in the Visualforce page, controller. The second Visualforce page is going to generate some HTML to return down to the requesting web browser. The user then fills out the second page with data. They submit that up to the server. Let's just assume everything went perfectly, and we decide to forward them onto the home tab or something like that. Okay? So the user went through many processes here in what was a pretty simple, a pretty straightforward two-step wizard. Okay? Now, when the user clicks on the final submit button here, so let's say that we're in our airline application and the user has said, I want to purchase this ticket. So they're going to purchase the ticket, and then we're going to forward them on to, you know, some sort of other travel website or something. We want to make sure that when they fill out this form and they indicate that they want to purchase the ticket, that we not only have their credit card information, but we also have their date and destination information that they entered in on the first page. We don't want to have them fill out their credit card and then go, oh, by the way, where did you say you wanted to go? Right? And so the way we do that is by tracking state, okay? And that's why we need to have a single controller, because the job of the single controller is to maintain the state across these different requests, all right? Across these different pages, I should say, all right? Now, how do we do that? How do we keep track of state? Well, we use something called view state, all right? And what view state is view state is a hidden input that is contained. So it's a hidden input that's contained within each page, and what it does is the view state here is associated with the different fields that the person filled out here. So the person on page 1 filled out the date and the destination that they wanted to travel to. What happens was that we called setters up here with the date and destination information, and we said we don't want to lose that. So what we're going to do is we're going to store the date and destination information inside a hidden input in this HTML page. Okay? Therefore, when the user enters in their credit card information and purchases the ticket, not only are they submitting their credit card information back up to the Salesforce server, but they're also submitting their date and destination information inside that hidden input. All right? That way, we can keep track of the state across these different pages. Remember what we said when we talked about transactions within Salesforce. There's no in-memory state other than things like custom settings or storing data in the database. You don't have access to something like a session object where you can, utilize memory space in Salesforce and keep it around cross-transaction. Because we can't keep around in-memory data, cross-transaction, we use the view state. All right? You can actually see how this is working in a Visualforce page. So I'm going to open up my web browser and I'm going to go to a little demo that I have here. This is a Visualforce page, and it's working with a controller. But one of the things that we can do here is I can simply right-click to view the page source. And when I bring up the page source, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Control-F and I'm going to search for view state. Okay? And there's a few references to it, but the important part is right here. So inside of this page, you'll notice that there is an input of type hidden. Its ID is com.salesforce.visualforce.viewState. So that hidden input that I was talking about over here, which actually there's one here too, that hidden input is this right here. And what we do is we take the values that you have been keeping track of in your controller, and we store them in an encrypted format inside this hidden input. Okay? All right. So if I fill this out, pretending that I had some data in here, unbeknownst to me, I'm also submitting up my view state. We control navigation by creating page references for our different Visualforce pages. It's really easy to create a back button. To create a back button, you just create a button that returns the page reference for the first page. Okay? So not too hard to figure that out. In fact, if you want to create something like a drop-down list where the user goes to, back to page 2 or 1 or whatever, you can easily do that. There is something called the view state viewer, and I'm going to come back to this and show it to you right after I talk about transient. So can you control what is placed in the view state? And the answer is yes, you can. The view state, because it has a maximum size, we might need to curtail what we're placing in it. And the way that we can do that is we can mark variables as being transient. So transient is a keyword that we apply to variables that we define within our controllers. And what transient says is very simple. Do not store this in the view state. In other words, if you need something like, in our case, in the previous app that we built where we had the table with the checkboxes, let's assume that we went on to a page 2, and after we're done sending the emails, we don't need to know what you checked. Well, we could mark those checkboxes as being transient. So it would call the setters, we would use them, and then when we went to the next page, we wouldn't keep track of them because we don't care. Okay? So anything that you don't need to keep track of, mark it as transient and do not store it in your view state. The smaller the view state, the better from a performance standpoint. All right, I have a little demo. It's in your course guide, so I'm going to show you this demo right here, which is a very simple implementation of a page and a controller. Okay, so let's take a look at this and take a look at what is happening when we interact with it. So first of all, here's this page, and this page is pretty simply constructed. It's got two timestamps, and they are called T1 and T2, all right? And they're being populated by calling the getter up in the controller. And so let me show you the controller. It's right here. So here are our two variables. There's T1, which is a date time, and then there's T2, which is also a date time. But I want to point out the fact that T2 has been marked with transient. Now, if we take a look, neither of them has a setter. Neither of them has a setter, and they have the exact same implementation of getters. So their getters are, between them, they're no different. It says, am I null? If I'm null, I'm going to take a timestamp of right now, and I'm going to return it as a string. Okay? All right. So if we go back to our page and we think about T1 and T2, T1 is not transient, T2 is. Now down here, I have a form, and you'll notice that the T1 and T2 are not inside that form, but all this is a command button. It doesn't even call an action method. It just submits the form up to the server. So if I click on this command button that has the value of push, what's going to happen is that by calling the command button, I am submitting the view state back up to the server. Okay? Now, because T1, that one was not transient, therefore it was stored within my view state. Since it is not null, the controller returns it back to me. Now, the T2 was null. And the reason T2 was null, because it was transient, it was not stored in the view state, and therefore, what does it do? It goes, okay, I'm going to have to refresh it. It's null, therefore I'm going to have to regenerate it. So every time I click on this, so notice it's 2218 versus 2225. Every time I click on this, notice that this one gets reset. There's a tool that we can use to actually see the view state, and it's this view state viewer right here. And what it does is it gives us a view into what's being stored in the view state. You'll notice that it's associated. View state's all about the variables in your controller, or for that matter, by the way, controller extension. Okay. So here I have T1. T1 has its value. Here's that 2218. T2 does not exist. Okay. Now, what do you think would happen here if I go up here and I either do a refresh or I do an enter on my URL? So if I go out here and I click on the enter key inside my URL, both of them get reset. And the reason that both get reset is that I just made a new HP GET request up to the server. I did not keep track of my view state by doing that. It would be the equivalent of setting a redirect. I've essentially lost that cache. Okay. So another way that you can clear out your view state if you're working with Visualforce pages is to do a redirect. Because a redirect says instruct the browser to make a request to this URL, and so then that discards everything, and we're now starting over fresh. There's an important rule that you need to follow, though, when you're working with state in a multi-step wizard, and that rule is that you can have a single Visualforce controller. You can also have a standard controller with an extension, or you can have a custom controller with extensions, or one or many. But here's the rule. In order to keep track of state, whether you have 0, 1, or many extensions, it has to be the same set being referenced across all your Visualforce pages. Okay? So you can't have Visualforce page 1 refer to this custom controller and some extension, and then the second page refer to this controller and some other extension. It has to be the same set of controllers and extensions across all pages. Okay? Otherwise, we lose track of what to keep track of because we have a different set of variables that we're monitoring. In addition, it's just, I use the term reconstituting these. We're only calling the constructor on the first request. Okay? So the constructor is not being called on subsequent requests. We are repopulating these data values, but like I showed you, it's not calling the setters when it's using the view state. Notice that in my case, this controller doesn't even have setters. Okay? So there's a difference between reconstituting those variables versus calling the setters because a user explicitly filled those out in the form.